In 2018, Brian Fallon co-founded an organization called Demand Justice, an organization whose mission was to make a broad majority of Americans understand the risks posed by the increasingly radical conservative majority on the Supreme Court and across lower courts as well. The group has pushed for sweeping changes to those institutions, sweeping changes to meet the urgency of what they say is a crisis in American jurisprudence. Brian Fallon has been warning us about this moment we're in now for nearly 4 years, and he and his organization have been thinking harder than any other about how to fix it. Joining us now is Brian Fallon, co-founder and executive director of Demand Justice. Brian, it's good to see you. Thank you for joining us tonight.
Thank you for having me.
What do you think needs to happen? What needs to happen to fix the Supreme Court, and what, in your opinion, is possible with fixing the Supreme Court?
Well, Ali, unfortunately, the events of the last week to 10 days, these huge cases involving gun safety, Roe, the ability for the EPA to regulate greenhouse gases, this is the culmination of a 50-year project that has been waged by the conservative legal movement, and it has frankly caught Democrats flat-footed. And it's an issue that as recently as 10 years ago when I was working in the Senate, I wasn't fully appreciating the urgency of it. And even during the 2016 campaign, when I worked on Hillary Clinton's presidential campaign, it was an issue, even though Merrick Garland's nomination was hanging in the balance, the opportunity to fill that Antonin Scalia seat was going to be decided by that election. Our voters, quite frankly, were not sufficiently motivated to come out and vote based on the Supreme Court. And that's a very dispiriting thing. But the events of the last few years, including the nomination of Brett Kavanaugh and Amy Coney Barrett, and now the decisions like the overturning of Roe that we saw last week, is causing the public to take notice. And so this is the positive thing that's happened. We have seen in poll after poll that the public disapproval of the Supreme Court as an institution is at its highest ever level. The public is crying out for something to be done to rein in the Supreme Court's power. And now we just need our party leaders to catch up to where the public increasingly is about wanting to corral this extreme, out-of-control Supreme Court. And the problem that we have is we have a party leadership that I very much admire, and people that I've worked closely to, that came of age politically at a time where talking about the court was dangerous or politically risky because it was frequently an issue seen as motivating Republican voters more so than Democratic voters. But polls in the last few weeks have shown that trend has shifted, and now Democratic voters and independents are saying that they are valuing the court as an issue in these midterms more than Republican voters were saying it. And so I think that we need our party leaders to react to this moment appropriately, channel the outrage that we're seeing in the public, and propose real, serious proposals to rein in the court's power.
So when you talk about Democrats being caught flat-footed, in fact, over the last 40 or 50 years, have Republican voters been more motivated, or has this been the work of the Federalist Society and the Koch brothers and the Chamber of Commerce and the peppering of conservative judges in local districts and some financing for them so that they win elections based on name recognition? I mean, were conservative voters all that more motivated about it than Democratic voters were, or were conservative organizations spearheading the selection of judges and the appointment of judges to lower courts who subsequently became Supreme Court justices?
I believe it was both. I believe it was a confluence, a sort of unholy marriage between conservative elites, namely corporatist Republicans that wanted to switch the courts to be a bastion for free enterprise in their terms, to crush labor unions. This was the Lewis Powell memo in the 1970s. Lewis Powell became a Supreme Court justice thanks to Richard Nixon, but he was in the early 1970s an advisor to the Chamber of Commerce. And that was the era of the peak of the Warren Court, or the twilight of the Warren Court, by the early 1970s. And he laid out a memo suggesting that conservative elites needed to start funding nonprofit institutions, needed to start being better represented in the legal academy, and start raising a new generation of law students that were trained to think in ways that were friendly to business interests. And in the forming of the Federalist Society, they founded an elite sort of petri dish that would train the next generation of law clerks and then judges to think and fashion these theories that Dahlia Lithwick in the previous segment was telling you, that are not based on the Constitution, that are not based on notions of originalism, that are wholly fabricated out of whole cloth based on outcome-based reasoning. But what they did was they paired that with a political strategy that formed a union with the evangelical movement in this country, weaponized the Roe issue. The Roe issue was not something right after 1973 that was immediately something that the Republicans seized on. It was something that about a decade later they realized had some political opportunity, that they could mobilize voters at a grassroots level, and also gun voters, and animating the Second Amendment issue as a way to mobilize voters at the polls, really in service of a project that was conceived of by the Republican legal establishment elites. So it was both. It was an on-the-ground foot soldier strategy combined with a lot of resource, deep pockets, and establishment types in the conservative legal movement.
Well, it's important to consider all of this now as we look at our court, and many Americans look at it with deep skepticism and disappointment. Brian, thanks very much for joining us tonight. Brian Fallon is the co-founder and executive director of Demand Justice. We appreciate your time.